Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Nell Bernstein. Nell is an award-winning journalist and one of the nation's leading voices on youth incarceration. I've read her book, Burning Down the House, which was a investigation into the brutality and failures of youth prisons. And she has a new book, In Our Future, We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison. So I guess I'll start with this question. What got you into youth justice?
Y- it started for me a long time ago in the 90s. So I'm dating myself. I was the editor of a youth newspaper in San Francisco. And, I'm sure you know the 90s were the height of youth incarceration and the height of the so-called superpredator era. And my staff came from all over the Bay, and it just was not that uncommon for them to get stopped by the police or sometimes arrested on their way to the office. And, when that happened, I would pull out my Ann Taylor suit that I had bought for the purpose of going to court with them and speak for them in court if I was allowed, or just stand next to them. And when that didn't work, I spent a lot of time visiting them in juvenile hall, and in the worst case scenarios, when they went on to the California Youth Authority, would correspond with them. And just over the years, I lost people I cared about to this system, and it got its teeth into me in a different way.
And one of your big findings in burning down the house, and we'll get to your more recent work in a minute, but one of the big findings, at least that stuck out to me, is that most of the kids inside youth prisons are not the worst of the worst, which I think is counterintuitive to most people. It was to me. What is going on there?
So that's shifted a bit, but not nearly enough. But yeah, once somebody is incarcerated and put in a uniform and given a number, all of that encourages us to see them as monsters. But young people were being arrested and incarcerated for really low level stuff, whether it was drugs or jumping a turnstile at BART, or, sometimes a kid can be incarcerated for skipping school. So there's all kinds of things that young people can be locked up for that adults can't. Uh, a small percentage of kids turned out to have done very serious acts of violence.
Yeah, and at the time in 2010, it was like one in four confined youth were held for, highly violent crimes like aggravated assault, robbery, homicide, sexual assault, things like that. But a lot of what people end up getting in trouble for are relatively low level offenses, but there's a big problem with that, right? Because once they get into the system, it's much harder to get out.
Yeah, and another important thing to remember is that what we understand as crime statistics are actually arrest statistics and prosecution statistics. So something like aggravated assault, that's a prosecutor's decision. So even so-called violent crime index offenses are not necessarily serious acts of violence. They might be and they might not be.
So let's kind of get to your more recent work. And, the big thing that stands out, 75% decline in youth incarceration. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I was introduced to these numbers in 2020. At, at that point, I think we were looking at maybe a 66, 67% drop in youth incarceration since 2000. I spent 4 or 5 years reporting my new book, In Our Future, We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison. Over that time, the decline continued. So at this point, since 2000, when youth incarceration peaked, we have seen a 75% drop in youth incarceration. And not only that, more than two-thirds of the nation's youth prisons have closed their doors. In California, we closed down our entire state youth prison system. And even people who follow criminal justice often don't know that that happened because it was barely covered. So it really is a silent sea change when it comes to youth incarceration and youth crime. We're hearing all this kind of rhetoric again that evokes the super predator rhetoric, but youth crime is also down 75% since 2000. It is at an all-time low since we began gathering statistics.
And so, what accounts for that?
Well, many things converged to make this happen. I don't mean to offer an advertisement, but you kind of have to read the book. But over the course of the past 25 years, there has just been concerted activism, first on the part of young people who are or have been incarcerated, a lot of efforts on the part of their families, lawsuit after lawsuit filed by civil rights attorneys. Back when we had a functioning DOJ, one DOJ investigation after another, and then just an array of advocates who understood that incarceration not only was making things worse for kids, but was failing to enhance public safety. So I think what we're really looking at here is a movement and one that has been stunningly successful.
And would you say that that movement has kind of survived this kind of pushback in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that because we are in the midst of a backlash on so many fronts, but since the pandemic, there has been a change of heart around youth crime. What happened during the pandemic, obviously, was that schools shut down, after school programs shut down, all kinds of social supports fell away, kids couldn't get jobs. So everything that kind of tethered them uh, was broken. And there was a number of short-term localized upticks in youth crime, and particularly carjacking, which is kind of the iconic crime of the super predator era. So that got a lot of attention. People were afraid, and not wrongly so. And then we had politicians in the media exacerbating and capitalizing on that fear. So since the pandemic, youth crime has dropped again. It's back to pre-pandemic levels. It's back to historic lows, but the backlash has not subsided. And unfortunately, the main manifestation is a push to try more kids as adults, which again was the signature move of the super predator era. And interestingly, a lot of advocates were afraid when youth prisons closed that judges who were looking for a harsh a harsh response would send more kids into the adult system. It turns out that there's been an 80% drop over the past 25 years in the number of kids charged and sentenced as adults. But that is shifting. A couple of months ago in Washington, D.C., after that young Doge staffer was supposedly carjacked, we started hearing talk of hordes and gangs and packs of youth, all the kind of dehumanizing language that we heard during the super predator years. And Congress has passed a couple of laws affecting DC youth because that's who Congress has control over. So we have a new law that now allows kids as young as 14 to be tried as adults in DC. We've got 6 or 7 states that have passed regressive laws increasing the number of kids who can be tried as adults. And in California, we've got, I don't know, at least 4 or 5 district attorneys who have explicitly overturned their predecessors' policies and pushed for charging more kids as adults. So the numbers, I just saw the 2023 numbers for youth incarceration, which weren't available to me when I finished the book. And for the first time in 25 years, there's a tiny uptick in the number of incarcerated youth. It's like 4,000 kids. So it's very small, but if you look at a chart of youth incarceration since 2000, it's a steady, unbroken decline. No zigs, no zags until 2023 when there's this tiny uptick. So the big picture is still very positive, but I think we do need to be aware of and responsive to this backlash.
There's so many places I want to go from here, but I guess I want to start kind of foundationally, and that is that we have learned a lot about juvenile brain development in the last, 25 years or so. And the main thing that we've learned is that, youths are not just small adults. They actually have not completed their brain development, which leads to all sorts of things that, we need to take into account when we think about what to do about juvenile crime.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because when I mentioned all the factors that had led to this decline, I actually do have a chapter that I neglected to mention called Who is a Child? It looks at the drop in youth prosecuted as adults, and it looks at the work of developmental psychologists and neuroscientists, which really propelled that drop. And it's kind of funny to me, as a parent, because anyone who's ever raised a teenager, been a teenager, met a teenager, we know intuitively that the adolescent brain is not fully developed until I guess scientists have decided it's age 25. Although someone recently told me that they've now determined that for boys it's actually age 26, which is hilarious to me because I have 24-year-old boy-girl twins. Um, so yeah, that has been a huge factor. And honestly, the targeting of Black and brown youth persists across the youth justice system, but it's particularly extreme when it comes to charging kids as adults. And that's why it's so worrisome to see it coming back, because to charge a child as an adult when we understand scientifically and intuitively that their brains aren't fully developed is to legally decree that some children are children and other children aren't children, and that dividing line is one that is highly determined by race.
And I guess to follow up on that, part of the problem with treating youths, I'm trying to not use the word juvenile, but I
Yeah, I don't use it
I
anymore
seem to be
either.
programmed into
Yep,
it.
we all are.
So, but we when we treat youths as adults, what happens is they become adults, and by that I mean they get sucked into the system, and then they become worse. The system, the youth justice system doesn't solve the problems; it exacerbates them.
Yeah, I mean, even incarcerating a kid as a kid increases the chances that that child will go on to commit more offenses as an adult, but incarcerating a kid as an adult greatly increases the chances that they will come out more likely to commit further crimes. It's funny, I don't think it turns them into adults though, because I've met a number of kids who've been charged as adults. And honestly, I think what happens, and there's research behind this, is that when you lock a kid up for 20 years at age 15, their development essentially stops
Yeah.
because those are the years when you're supposed to be out there taking risks. You're supposed to be exploring the world. You're supposed to be figuring out who you are in relation to other people. So when you isolate a kid during those crucial developmental years, I think in many ways you're denying them the opportunity to grow up.
Yeah, and that seems to be a problem in prison in general. So, even somebody who's 21, when they go in, if they're in for 20, 30 years, they're still in a lot of ways that 21-year-old, like they didn't experience the life experiences that people that weren't incarcerated experience.
Yeah, and I think that's important for a couple reasons. One is that the dialogue around what we're going to do about youth crime tends to posit that we have to make a choice between doing what's developmentally best for kids and keeping ourselves safe, when all the evidence shows the opposite. Again, that youth incarceration, and particularly incarcerating them as adults, is criminogenic. So it actually works against the goal of public safety. So it turns out that we can have both free children and safe streets. That's just not the narrative we're fed. And the evidence for that, again, is that as youth incarceration has plummeted, so has youth crime.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit. You had mentioned DC in the recent case, and that reminded me of kind of the poster child case for all of this, which was the Central Park case, and which has so many interesting aspects to it. It's a wrongful conviction case. It's this paranoia about the super predators, which we're going to talk about in a minute. There's even, a linkage to Donald Trump
Right.
because
Same guy, same rhetoric.
yeah. So it's really interesting. And then, of course, one of the fellows is now on the New York City Council. So, they got this one wrong. And they got it wrong in so many different ways.
Right. I actually had the opportunity to virtually meet Yusuf Salam, and he just was such a lovely, forgiving man, given what he had been through. Uh, we got it wrong in a lot of ways, but the primary way that we got it wrong was, again, highly racialized. We took a group of Black children, invented kind of horrific language. Isn't that where the term wilding originated?
Hmm.
Completely dehumanized them, as you said. Donald Trump, I'm saying the name, took out a full page ad in the New York Times calling for them to be executed, as I recall. And interestingly, because that guy can't be wrong, he continues to defame them and
Yep.
talk about them as monsters. So yeah, it's interesting. We do that a lot. That one is a difficult example because they didn't do it, but we take a particular incident and use that to gin up public fear and then to create damaging laws. So I do think justice by anecdote is a problem. But if you think about it, it makes so much sense politically that if you want to get votes, first you scare people, then you tell them, but I'm the guy who can keep you safe. Like, of course that's effective.
Yep. And it kind of foreshadowed the Trump era because, you can totally see, 1990 version of Trump, and the 2025 version of Trump, not that different.
Very consistent fellow. And it's interesting too, because like you said, we got that one wrong. And maybe I'm optimistic here, but they did it again with the vilification of immigrants, the eating the cats, eating the dogs nonsense. And now, you hear about people who may have voted for Trump, but they're upset because, their gardener got swept up by ice, or the woman who runs the local bakery. So I like to think that when we get it that wrong, when we scare people and then they come to understand that it's not monsters we're incarcerating, it's their neighbor, it's their friend. Maybe that buffers this punitive instinct, but I'm not sure.
And that leads me to the super predator, which, I'm old enough to remember, the warnings about the super predator and these mindless kids that are so much more violent than everyone else, and so we have to create all these exceptional lock them up and throw away the key punishments for youth offenders. Talk a little bit about how that came about, and then kind of the data that shows that it was completely false.
Right. So the interesting thing about the super predator story was that it wasn't just talk. It was actually cooked up at Princeton by a guy named John DiIulio, who essentially spliced speculative demographics to longstanding racist tropes to come up with this academic theory that as so it was true that there was a demographic change underway, that we were seeing and would see more young people, and particularly a more diverse group of young people. That was true. So he took that and then he added this racist caricature of a group of young people, these super predators who, on the one hand, had kind of animalistic superpowers, and on the other hand, were subhuman. And the media just ran with it. It was on the cover because he was a Princeton professor and he claimed to have evidence for this. So it was all over the media. People talk a lot about how Hillary Clinton used that language. A guy
Mhm.
named Joe Biden also bought into that and
Mhm.
claimed that there were kids out there who were so dangerous we had no choice but to lock them up for a long time. Young people, I have a chapter called Slaying the Super Predator because they did that one in by not committing the crimes that they had preemptively been accused of. And eventually DiIulio had to recant and take back what he had said. I think Hillary Clinton apologized. And Joe Biden, when he was president, appointed a woman named Liz Ryan to head the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which was an astonishing move because Liz is one of the country's preeminent voices against the practice of incarcerating youth. And he appointed her to be the top juvenile justice official in the country. And with her prodding, I'm sure, he even drafted a budget that not only called for community investment over youth incarceration, it actually incentivized the closure of youth prisons. So that does show how much the narrative has shifted and how powerful this movement that people like Liz and others have been part of for 25 years ultimately proved to be.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the questions I think, our listeners are going to ask are what are the alternatives to incarceration? And I like this stat, so I like to throw it out. But, in California, where both of us live, the average K through 12, and now it's PK through 12 or 13 or whatever it is, student, we're spending somewhere around 13 to $15,000 a year to educate them. If you go up a level to, the UC system, we're talking maybe 40 to $50,000 a year when you factor in, the state funding and everything else. To incarcerate one person a year, I've seen everywhere from 100 to 150,000. Some of that is kind of contingent on, compensation for correctional officers and things like that. But I mean, the bottom line is that our incentive structure is backward, right? Like we should be spending $150,000 a year on our K through 12 students and, much less on incarcerating people and locking them in a cage. But it does show the societal values that are at play. And, we know who ends up incarcerated. They're people that are from disadvantaged backgrounds. They came up in poverty. Many of them are black and brown people, although increasingly, we're also seeing, these kind of rural poor ending up in the prison system as well, which is something I think, we haven't paid enough attention to. But the bottom line is, if we invest on the front end, we probably pay a lot less on the back end. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And actually, as the number of kids incarcerated has dropped, the per capita cost of incarcerating them has risen. I think it's in California, the average is 250 or 300,000, but in some counties, it's $1 million per kid. And that because there's so few kids, but they're
Damn.
still running not our state youth prisons anymore, but county juvenile detention centers that in some cases are almost empty. So there's that. I also want to say, like, you're absolutely right that poor white kids are among those who are incarcerated, but as the number of kids has incarcerated has dropped, so-called racial disparities, which I think is too weak a word, have gotten worse. So when I wrote Burning Down the House, a black teenager, and this is despite the fact that across racial groups, delinquency itself is pretty stable and pretty universal. I think that it was a black kid was 3.7 times more likely to be incarcerated. Now they're 5 times more likely to be incarcerated. So it's actually white kids who have benefited the most from these reforms. But you're really asking, I think, a larger question, right? Which is what keeps us safe.
Right.
And I feel like I got that wrong in Burning Down the House. In Burning
Hmm.
Down the House, I looked at so-called evidence-based programs with fancy names like multisystemic therapy and functional family therapy. And these are good programs that wrap therapeutic supports around a kid and a family. But what I've come to understand since then is that those interventions still posit the locus of the problem as a kid or a family and don't take into account social inequities. Honestly, what do I think is the best alternative to incarcerating a kid? Not incarcerating the kid. Because we talked about brain development. White kids in neighborhoods like mine are, I think 90% of all Americans in confidential interviews have said that as teenagers they did something that was against the law. A white kid in a well-resourced neighborhood gets the privilege of growing out of it. If we let everybody just grow out of it and didn't subject black and brown kids to this toxic intervention, just that would go a long way towards public safety. But really, I explore this in the last couple chapters of the book. I asked a lot of young people, what do they think would make their communities safer? I looked at the research. Like you said, it's schools, it's parks, it's after school activities, it's mental health supports when they need them, it's drug treatment when they need them. There's a woman I interviewed named Candace Jones who ran the Illinois youth justice system for several years with the express intent of running that system into the ground. And she's from Chicago. And I remember her saying to me, we know exactly what public safety looks like. It looks like Evanston. It looks like Hyde Park, which are largely white, well-to-do neighborhoods in Chicago. So really, and this is, I think, it's the opportunity, but it's also the challenge. The real answer to public safety is equity. And that's unfortunately, we're moving in the other direction when it comes to that in this country.
And I completely agree. And also, just to frame this properly, like I'm an abolitionist. I believe most people should not be in a cage, whether they're kids or adults. Because, you just you look at the threat most people face pose to society, and it's minimal. And in a lot of cases, we incarcerate people long after they're any kind of threat. That said, what do you do about the 15-year-old who, unfortunately in my community this actually happened, a 15-year-old literally stabbed this elderly couple to death and, cut them open and pulled out their organs and all sorts of other weird
Right.
stuff. Um, what do you do about that kid?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that because I think we have these conversations about abolition without thinking about the victims of youth crime. And, honestly, I've been a victim of youth crime. I had a drunk, angry kid hold a gun to my head. So I know what that feels like. I know the terror. I know the desire for that kid just to go away. I don't know if I am an abolitionist. I don't think this particular guy did not need to be locked up, as it turned out, but the kid you're talking about, I was talking to a really wise friend about this the other day. How do I answer that question? And what she said is absolutely some kids need to be sat down for a minute. They need to be pulled off the street because they're posing a danger. What they don't need is to be isolated and tortured. So yeah, of course there are times when somebody poses such a danger that they can't be on the street, but do they need to be in a prison-like institution where they're separated from any opportunity at human connection? Do they need to be beaten? Do they need to be pepper sprayed? These are all things that are happening just as consistently in our institutions as they were 25 years ago. The other thing I would say, and this might seem like a cop out, is that, we're a country with more guns than people. If we genuinely were concerned about public safety, if that were the real reason that we were incarcerating people, we would take guns off the street, not kids. Like just imagine if we didn't have guns, most of these crimes that are so serious and so violent that we really do have to intervene just wouldn't be happening. So what that tells me is that, yeah, of course the kid you're talking about, you know, a rec center is not going to do it. But those are also a very small percentage of the kids we locked up.
Yeah, and that's the most important point, I think, is that that kid is an exception. And actually, it's interesting. Like the people in my community are convinced that that guy was a psychopath and that, he was gonna become a serial killer. I know people that have been incarcerated with him, and he's kind of gotten past most of that stuff. And so, even for the extreme example, it's not, like I think he got a 50-year sentence or something, which was the most that they could do for somebody of his age. And the battle right now is whether he can get resentenced under youth sentencing laws.
I'm glad you
Um,
brought that up.
and people here are mortified of it, but after talking with people that were incarcerated with him, I'm not convinced that everybody knows exactly what the future is. Like,
Right.
clearly, he was messed up at the time when he committed the crime, but I don't know that he still poses that threat. But, people are gonna be pretty skittish about that crime, and I understand. I mean, like, this is a community where, most years there isn't a murder, and this was a brutal murder. And so, yeah, I can understand that. But the other point, and you talk to abolitionists who I think are realists about it, is they'll admit, like, now we can't, like, just let everybody out of prison. Like, we need to, like, our goal should be to reduce the footprint as much as possible, and change the kind of issues that we were just talking about, the equity issues, education issues. I remember a couple years ago, St. Louis, Missouri had the highest murder rate in the country, and there was a mind-boggling stat in there that every single person that had committed a murder that in St. Louis one year, and every single victim of a murder in St. Louis that year did not have a high school degree. And so like that's like staring you in the face, right? I mean, like, I'm not saying that education is a panacea, but it helps a lot.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up what you did about, this notion that even someone who's committed a really horrific act can change. I just published a story in the imprint where I talked to men who had been given juvenile life without parole sentences. So, there was a body in each of these cases. They had done really serious things at the age of 14 or 15. And then I think, as you were talking about, under these second look laws that emerged out of the neuroscience that we were talking about, they had the opportunity to be resentenced. And a remarkable number of these guys are mentors, credible messengers, community violence interveners, and the recidivism rate for people who've been given long or life sentences and then have been released is like 1%. So, so yeah, absolutely. A kid like who's done something like what you're talking about does need to be taken off the street. Do they need to spend 50 years in prison? There's no evidence base for that. And the other problem is that we have these mandatory sentencing laws that don't allow us to look at the individual, both at the time that they're sentenced and as they may change over time.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that the more you can evaluate things in real time as opposed to try to predict things, which, let's face it, humans are horrible at predicting the future. Every single scientific study has proven that. And so the idea that we know that a 15-year-old is always going to be a threat to society is stupid. I'll be blunt about it.
And our thinking about risk is also skewed. I think what you're saying is the community doesn't want to take the risk
Right.
that he will come out in 20 years and
Well,
do
it's
things.
worse than that. They don't want to take the risk that somebody who evaluates them in 20 years can make a more informed decision than they can today.
But we're willing to take the risk that our schools will get shut up because
Right.
we think it's really important that we be allowed to go to Walmart and buy assault weapons. We're just not logical when we think about risk.
Yeah, I was reading this story yesterday, and this woman knocked on the wrong door. I think it was in
Yeah, there's a
Ohio
story
or
like that.
somewhere,
Yeah.
and the guy shot her through the door. And it's like the argument is always, oh, just arm everybody, and then it'll be a safe society. Well, I mean, that woman did nothing wrong other than knock on the wrong door. And all she did was knock. It wasn't like she was breaking in. She knocked on the door.
Yeah, I mean, you see these stories all the time, and maybe the person who does it does get locked up, but that didn't prevent her from getting shot. I just think we have these conversations in the name of public safety, but we're not serious about what actually creates public safety,
And also, they charged him with a misdemeanor, sorry, manslaughter.
right? I mean,
So,
this is a stand your ground state, it sounds like.
uh, yeah, I think it was Ohio, maybe it was Illinois.
Maybe
You
it
know,
was both, because I feel like we see these stories more and more.
yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of these stories, especially after COVID. We're pretty much out of time here, but just share with people once again the name of the book and where they can get it.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate that. It's In Our Future We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison. You can get it, as they say, wherever books are sold. I also, I'm so fascinated and inspired by this movement that I want to keep looking at it. So I also have started a Substack, which you can find at nellbernstein.substack.com.
All right, I'll subscribe to that because
That will make me happy.
like I said, I really enjoyed your previous book. It was
Burning down the house.
eye-opening, Burning Down the House. Um, So I'm gonna try to get your new book and go from there. I think this is really important work. A lot of people don't think about this stuff, unfortunately, and it's tragic because, unfortunately, in the name of public safety, we are ruining people's lives, and we're probably endangering more lives than we save by these practices.
That is true. I want to take this last moment, though, to say that In Our Future We Are Free is actually a hopeful book. Because it looks, we're in this moment, I think, where so many of us are wondering, how do we resist an authoritarian state? The book is about activists who were living under the boot of an authoritarian system and still found ways to resist and were very successful. So I
It
just don't
is
want to end on an entirely bleak note.
Yeah, it's just very hard for me to be optimistic these days.
Read the book, you'll feel a little better.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks, Nell, for joining us. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.